Daniel drove slowly along the quiet road that curved around the big lake. The air was calm, and the water reflected the sunlight like a sheet of glass. It was his first day arriving at the lakeside property he had recently bought, and he felt excited. For a long time, Daniel had wanted a place away from the noise of the city. When he found this house by the lake, he knew it was the right choice. It was not huge, but it was peaceful, with tall trees in the backyard and a small dock where he could keep his fishing boat. He imagined weekends spent reading by the water, fishing in the early mornings, and enjoying simple, quiet evenings. The house was not inside the local homeowners association, though it stood very close to the community that surrounded most of the lake. Daniel had checked the property maps carefully before buying. The HOA had rules that he thought were too strict, like controlling paint colors, yard decorations, and even what cars people could park in their driveways. He liked freedom, and the idea of living without being told what kind of mailbox to install was important to him. His property was just outside the HOA boundary, and that gave him comfort. He wanted to live peacefully without unnecessary arguments. As he unloaded boxes from his truck, he noticed a woman walking briskly toward him. She was in her late 50s, dressed in neat clothes, carrying a clipboard in one hand and a phone in the other. Her expression was sharp, her steps quick, as if she had urgent business. Daniel put down his box and greeted her politely. "Good afternoon," he said with a smile. The woman did not return the smile. Instead, she looked at the truck, then at the small fishing boat attached to the back, then at Daniel. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice filled with authority. "I'm Karen. I'm the president of the Lakeview HOA. I keep this community running smoothly." Daniel nodded politely. "Nice to meet you. I'm Daniel. I just moved in today." Karen's eyes scanned the yard and the house. "I see you've painted the shutters a dark green. That won't work here. You'll need to change that to beige or white. Also, your boat trailer cannot be parked outside. It must be in a garage, and the grass is already a little high. We have standards here." Daniel listened calmly, though he knew she was mistaken. "I appreciate your concern," he said in a respectful tone. "But this property is not part of the HOA. I checked the records carefully. My land is just outside the association's boundaries." Karen frowned as if she had not heard him. "That can't be right. All homes around this side of the lake are under the HOA. I'll need you to sign some documents and pay the first month's fees. Otherwise, we'll start the fine process. Rules are rules." Daniel picked up his box again and spoke in a gentle voice. "I understand, but truly this house is not within HOA limits. You can check the county records if you like. I made sure of it before I bought the place." Karen's lips tightened. She did not like being challenged. "I've been running this neighborhood for 10 years. I know every property. People who think they're exceptions soon learn the truth. Don't make this difficult." Daniel could feel the edge in her words, but he stayed calm. He did not want conflict on his first day. He nodded politely and carried his box inside. He thought maybe Karen would check the facts later and leave him alone, but she didn't. The next morning, Daniel stepped outside with a cup of coffee and looked at the lake. It was peaceful with a few birds gliding over the water, but soon he saw Karen again walking toward him. She had 2 other people with her, both carrying clipboards. They stopped in front of his yard. "We need to address some violations," Karen announced. "First, your boat trailer. Second, the mailbox design. Third, your roof color. None of this is in compliance." Daniel placed his coffee on the porch rail and walked down to meet them. He kept his voice steady. "Again, this property is not under HOA rules. I respect your organization, but my home is outside your control." The 2 board members glanced at each other. One whispered to Karen, "He may be right." But Karen shook her head firmly. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to avoid responsibility. We can't allow someone to break standards. If we let him get away with this, others will follow." Daniel quietly noted their words, realizing he might have to keep records of every encounter. He did not raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he simply repeated, "I'm not under the HOA. You may confirm it with the county." Then he turned back toward his porch, showing he would not argue further. Karen looked frustrated. She raised her phone and took pictures of his house, yard, and boat. "We'll see about this," she muttered. Over the next few days, Daniel focused on unpacking and setting up his home. But almost every day, Karen appeared. She pointed out the color of his fence, the size of his doghouse, even the flowers planted by the walkway. Each time, Daniel gave the same calm answer. He never shouted, He never insulted her. But inside, he knew she was preparing for a larger fight. One afternoon, Daniel was fixing the dock by the lake when a neighbor came by. The neighbor, a kind older man, said softly, "You seem like a nice fellow. Just a warning. Karen doesn't like when people tell her no. She's used to everyone following her orders. Be careful. She'll try to make life hard for you." Daniel thanked him for the advice. He already understood what kind of person Karen was. She liked control. She liked power. And she didn't like being told she was wrong. But Daniel had dealt with such personalities before. He had patience and he had training that gave him the ability to stay calm under pressure. As the sun set that evening, Daniel stood on his dock and looked across the lake. The water shimmered with colors of orange and gold. He thought about why he had chosen this place. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place to rest after years of hard work. Yet on his very first week, he had found himself in the middle of an unnecessary battle. Still, Daniel felt no regret. He knew who he was. He knew the truth about his property, and he knew he had the strength to deal with whatever came next. He just hoped that in time, Karen would realize her mistake and leave him alone. But deep inside, he suspected she would not stop until she had pushed things too far. And so, as the evening grew quiet and the lake reflected the stars, Daniel prepared himself. This was only the beginning. The following week at the lake was not as peaceful as Daniel had hoped. Every morning he tried to start the day with calm routines. He brewed a fresh cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and enjoyed the gentle breeze coming off the water. The lake shimmered in the early light and birds sang in the tall trees behind his house. For short moments, Daniel felt he had found exactly the kind of life he wanted. But those moments never lasted long, because Karen always seemed to find a reason to appear. On Monday, she arrived at his property again, this time carrying a thick folder. She walked straight to the edge of his yard as if she owned it. Without greeting him, she began speaking loudly. "Daniel, I have prepared a list of violations. These are serious issues. You must fix them within 30 days or you'll face penalties." Daniel looked at her calmly, setting his coffee mug down. "I've explained before. My house is outside the HOA. Your rules don't apply here." Karen waved her hand, brushing off his words. "That's nonsense. You're surrounded by HOA homes. Of course you're under our authority. You cannot just live here as if you're special." He remained polite, but his patience was being tested. "Karen, I respect what you do for your community. But my property line is clear. I checked the county office myself. If you don't believe me, you should confirm it with them instead of harassing me." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Harassing? No, this is enforcement. If you think you can ignore me, you'll regret it." Daniel didn't reply. He picked up his coffee again and walked back to his porch. He decided not to argue further. But he took out his phone, opened the camera, and snapped a picture of Karen standing at his property line with the folder. He saved it quietly. Evidence would matter later if things escalated. The next day, Karen returned with two men. They introduced themselves as members of the HOA board. Both looked uncomfortable, as if they didn't want to be there but had been pulled into the matter. Karen pointed at Daniel's mailbox and said, "See? Wrong design. It must be replaced." One of the men cleared his throat and said softly, "Karen, maybe we should double-check the records before pushing too far. If his land is exempt, then—" Karen silenced him with a sharp glance. "Don't undermine me. I know what I'm doing." Then she turned back to Daniel. "You'll be receiving official letters soon." "You cannot avoid this," Daniel stayed calm. He answered in the same steady tone. "Send whatever you want. But understand I will respond with the truth. My house is not under HOA law." For the rest of the week, Karen continued her campaign. She showed up when Daniel was mowing the lawn, pointing out that his grass wasn't trimmed to HOA standards. She came while he was painting his deck, telling him the color wasn't approved. She even stopped him while he was unloading groceries, demanding he remove his small doghouse because pets are not allowed to have outside shelters. Each time, Daniel gave the same answer: "I am not under your rules." He never raised his voice. He never insulted her, but inside he knew Karen's persistence was unusual. She seemed almost obsessed with controlling him. By Thursday, rumors had spread among the neighbors. As Daniel walked by the local store near the lake, he noticed a few people whispering. Some gave him cautious looks. One woman even asked, "Are you really refusing to follow the HOA? Karen says you're breaking all the rules." Daniel smiled politely and replied, "I'm not part of the HOA, that's all there is to it." He didn't explain further, because he knew time would reveal the truth. Still, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. Instead of welcoming him, some neighbors already viewed him with suspicion, all because of Karen's words. That night, Daniel sat at his dining table with a notebook. He wrote down every encounter with Karen, including dates and times. He saved photos of her visits. He even recorded the messages she left on his door, demanding payments or threatening fines. His training had taught him that keeping records was the best way to protect himself. He wasn't angry. He was patient, careful, and determined. Friday brought another confrontation. Daniel was sitting on his dock, tying new ropes for his boat, when Karen showed up again. She called out across the yard, "Daniel, I will not repeat myself. You must come to the HOA meeting tomorrow. We'll vote on your compliance. If you refuse, you'll face further action." Daniel stood and looked at her. The calm in his eyes unsettled her, though she pretended otherwise. "Karen," he said firmly, "I will not attend. Your group has no authority over me. Please stop coming onto my property. This is the last time I'll say it politely." Karen's face turned red. She clenched her clipboard tighter. "You think you're above everyone else? Fine, you'll see what happens." With that, she stormed off, muttering to herself. The next morning, Daniel noticed several neighbors gathering near the community hall by the lake. Karen had clearly called a meeting, and she was speaking loudly to the crowd. Daniel didn't need to hear the details to know she was talking about him. People glanced toward his house as she gestured and waved her hands. He could feel the tension rising in the community. Some neighbors believed her version of the story. Others looked unsure. Daniel decided to remain quiet, but he also knew the situation was reaching a breaking point. Karen was no longer just complaining. She was trying to rally everyone against him. Later that afternoon, while Daniel was trimming the branches of a tree in his yard, Karen walked up again, her voice sharp and commanding. "This is your final warning. Either sign these papers and join the HOA, or I will call the police. You will not get away with ignoring us." Daniel looked at her without fear. He put down his tools and wiped his hands. "Karen, I will never sign those papers. Do what you think you must, but know that the truth will come out." Her eyes blazed with anger. She shook the papers at him, then stuffed them back into her folder. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed. "I'll have the authorities deal with you." Daniel nodded once. "Do what you feel is right." Then he turned back to his work, showing her that her threats did not shake him. As the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, Daniel sat quietly on his porch. He watched the lake turn shades of orange and pink. The air was cool and the sound of crickets rose from the grass. He thought about everything that had happened in just a few days. What was supposed to be a peaceful move had turned into daily conflict, but Daniel was not worried. He was prepared. He had faced worse situations in his life. Karen believed she was in control, but she had no idea who she was truly dealing with. Daniel's patience was steady, but beneath it was strength that could not be shaken. He knew Karen would take the next step soon. He knew she would call the police, and he also knew that when that moment came, everything would change. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness around the lake, but Daniel could sense something different in the air. He woke early, brewed his coffee, and stood on his porch looking out over the calm water. The mist floated lightly above the surface, and for a short while he enjoyed the quiet. But his thoughts were not calm. He knew Karen was reaching her limit. She had already warned him the day before that she would involve the police if he did not obey. Daniel believed her. He knew her type. She would not rest until she felt victorious. By mid-morning, Daniel was fixing a loose board on his dock when he saw Karen walking quickly toward his property again. She had her phone in one hand and a few papers in the other. Her steps were sharp, her expression tense. A couple of neighbors followed behind her at a distance, clearly curious about what might happen next. Daniel sighed quietly, put away his hammer, and waited. Karen stopped just short of his yard, raising her voice so that the neighbors could hear. "Daniel, this is it. I've given you chance after chance, and you continue to disrespect this community. You refuse to pay your dues. You refuse to follow our rules, and you think you can live however you like. That ends today." Daniel kept his tone calm. "Karen, I've explained many times. My property is not part of the HOA. You don't have authority here. I won't argue with you anymore." Her face flushed. "You're a liar," she shouted. "Every house around this lake belongs to the HOA. You're no exception. If you don't move your boat and repaint your shutters by this afternoon, I'll have the police come and deal with you." Daniel stood straight, his hands resting calmly at his sides. "You may call them if you believe it will help. I have nothing to hide." Karen glared at him for a long moment, then pulled out her phone. She turned away slightly, but her voice was still loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Yes, officer," she said into the phone. "I need you to come right away. We have a suspicious man here refusing to comply with community rules. He's hostile and uncooperative. Yes, he's at the new house by the dock. Please hurry," the neighbors nearby whispered to each other. Some looked worried. Others seemed entertained by the drama. Karen ended the call and crossed her arms, standing tall as if victory was already hers. Daniel quietly walked back to his porch and sat down. He didn't appear worried. He simply took out his notebook, made a note of the date and time, and then looked across the lake as if nothing unusual had happened. Inside, he felt steady. He had expected this moment. It didn't take long before the sound of sirens grew faint in the distance. Soon a patrol car rolled slowly down the narrow road and pulled up near Daniel's driveway. 2 officers stepped out, one older with a calm face, the other younger and more eager. They looked around, then approached carefully. Karen rushed to meet them, pointing dramatically toward Daniel. "There he is," she exclaimed. "That's the man I told you about. He refuses to follow the law of this community. He's dangerous, officer. You need to remove him at once." The older officer raised his hand to calm her. "Ma'am, we'll handle it. Please step aside." Karen looked satisfied, folding her arms and standing to the side with a smug smile. A few more neighbors had gathered now, forming a small crowd. All eyes were on Daniel as the officers approached his porch. "Sir," the older officer said firmly, "we've received a complaint. Can we see some identification and hear your side of the story?" Daniel rose slowly, respectful in his manner. "Of course, officer. My name is Daniel. I own this property. I'm not part of the HOA. They've been harassing me for days, insisting I follow rules that don't apply to me." The younger officer frowned. "The HOA president said you've been refusing compliance and causing trouble." Daniel shook his head calmly. "That's not true. I've been polite at every encounter. I've simply stood my ground. This property is legally outside their control. I can show you documents from the county if needed." The older officer studied him for a moment. Something about Daniel's steady voice and calm eyes seemed different from the usual homeowner disputes he dealt with. "Sir, may I see your ID?" Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed it over. The officer looked at the driver's license first, then his eyes widened slightly when Daniel also revealed another small card, a badge. Karen, who had been standing proudly a few feet away, froze. Her smile vanished, replaced with shock. Her face went pale as she realized what she was seeing. The neighbors gasped softly. Whispering spread quickly through the small crowd. The older officer handed back the badge with respect. "Understood, sir. Thank you." His tone was different now, more formal. Karen stepped forward nervously. What is that? What's going on?" Daniel looked directly at her. His voice was calm but firm. "Karen, you called the police on me, claiming I was suspicious. You accused me of things that aren't true. What you didn't know is that I'm a federal law enforcement officer. I moved here recently for peace, not conflict. But your false claims could have caused serious problems." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clutched her clipboard tighter. The crowd of neighbors stared at her, their earlier doubts now replaced with surprise and even embarrassment on her behalf. The younger officer looked uncomfortable. He turned to Karen and said, "Ma'am, if his property isn't under your HOA, then you have no authority here. And calling us with exaggerated claims isn't acceptable." Karen stammered, I didn't exaggerate. I thought he..." The older officer cut her off gently. "You need to be careful. Making false reports can have consequences." Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He simply looked steady and strong. "All I've wanted is to live peacefully here. I've shown patience even when you came to my property every day with demands. But enough is enough. This has to stop." Karen's face turned red again, but this time from embarrassment, not anger. The neighbors who had once believed her stories now looked at her differently. A few shook their heads. One whispered, "She's gone too far this time." The police officers nodded to Daniel respectfully before turning back toward their car. "We'll mark this as resolved," the older one said. "If there are further issues, we'll know who to trust." As they drove away, the small crowd slowly dispersed. Some neighbors gave Daniel small nods of respect. Others avoided Karen's eyes as they walked back to their homes. Karen stood frozen for a long moment, her power crumbling in front of everyone. She finally turned and walked away quickly, her steps unsteady. Her clipboard pressed tightly against her chest as if she could hide behind it. Daniel returned to his porch and sat down again. He picked up his coffee, now cold, and took a slow sip. He looked out at the lake, calm as ever, and let out a quiet breath. He knew this was not the end of the story, but it was the turning point. The truth had been revealed. The mask had come off. The lake glimmered under the afternoon sun, and for the first time since moving in, Daniel felt that maybe peace was finally possible. Still, he remained cautious. Karen was humiliated, but he doubted she would give up so easily. Yet whatever she tried next, Daniel was ready. After the police left, the air around the lake felt heavier. The neighbors who had gathered went back to their homes, but the whispers continued. Daniel could see curtains shifting slightly as people peeked out of their windows. Some looked at him with newfound respect, while others kept their distance, uncertain of what they had just witnessed. Karen, who had always carried herself like the ruler of the neighborhood, had been exposed. She had called the police thinking she would humiliate him, but instead she was the one left standing, red-faced and powerless. Daniel, however, did not celebrate. He wasn't the type to feel joy from someone else's embarrassment. He simply sat back on his porch watching the lake and thinking about what had just happened. He knew that moments like these often became stories that spread quickly in small communities. By evening, the entire neighborhood would know that he was not just another homeowner, but someone with a badge, someone with authority. As the sun lowered, Daniel grilled some food outside, hoping to enjoy a quiet dinner. A few neighbors walked by offering polite greetings. One man even stopped to apologize. "Sorry about earlier," the neighbor said. "Karen told us you were being difficult." "I see now that wasn't true." Daniel gave him a calm smile. "It's all right. I know how rumors work. Thank you for saying that." The neighbor nodded and walked on. That short exchange was enough to remind Daniel that truth always had a way of showing itself, but Karen did not disappear. Though humiliated, she was not the kind of person who would admit defeat easily. The very next morning, Daniel saw her again, though this time she didn't come close. She stood across the street, talking to two neighbors in hushed tones. Every now and then she glanced at Daniel's house. It was clear she was trying to regain control of the story, to paint herself as the victim. Later in the afternoon, Daniel received a letter taped to his door. It wasn't official. It had no county seal, no legal weight. It was just a paper typed out by Karen, stamped with the HOA's logo. It demanded that he pay past due fees and threatened further action if he didn't comply. Daniel read it once, shook his head, and added it to his growing folder of records. He wasn't angry, but he was becoming more determined to put an end to her behavior. By the second day, Karen escalated again. She gathered several neighbors near the lake, holding what looked like a small meeting. She spoke loudly, her voice carrying across the water. "This man disrespects all of us," she declared. "He thinks rules don't matter. If we let him get away with this, everything we've built will fall apart." Daniel listened from his porch but didn't respond. He refused to be dragged into shouting matches. He simply took out his camera and recorded the gathering from a distance. If Karen wanted to play games, he would answer with patience and proof. That evening, a different neighbor came by. She was a kind, elderly woman named Margaret. She brought a basket of cookies and spoke softly. "I've lived here 20 years, she said. "Karen means well sometimes, but she forgets her limits. Don't let her trouble you too much. People are already starting to see the truth." Daniel thanked her warmly. The simple act of kindness touched him more than she knew. It reminded him that not everyone was against him. Some people simply needed time to understand. On the third day, Karen made her boldest move yet. Daniel was outside fixing a fence post when two uniformed men arrived. Not police this time, but what appeared to be HOA security contractors. They walked up stiffly, as if uncertain of their role. One of them cleared his throat and said, "Sir, we've been asked to inform you that you are in violation of HOA rules and must attend a compliance hearing." Daniel looked at them steadily. I'm not under your HOA. You have no authority here. If you step on my property again to enforce false rules, I'll consider it trespassing." The two men shifted uncomfortably. They were not prepared for his calm firmness. Without another word, they turned back toward Karen, who stood watching from a distance with her arms crossed. She looked furious when they returned to her, and she gestured wildly, but they shook their heads. Daniel could tell they had no interest in pushing further. That night, Daniel sat at his desk reviewing the folder of evidence he had collected: photographs, letters, notes, and now even recordings. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was preparing for the day when Karen would push too far, and he would need to make everything official. He didn't want it to come to that, but he knew it was possible. The following morning, the lake was quiet again. Daniel thought maybe Karen had finally realized the truth. But around noon, she appeared once more, this time alone. She walked to the edge of his yard and stopped, her voice lower than before. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone," she said bitterly. "Do you have any idea what that felt like?" Daniel set down the book he was reading and looked at her calmly. "Karen, I didn't embarrass you. You embarrassed yourself. You called the police on false claims. You pushed rules that don't apply to me. That was your choice." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "You think you're untouchable because of that badge. But you don't belong here. This is my community. I built this place." Daniel stood slowly, his voice steady and strong. "Karen, listen carefully. I don't want conflict. I never did. I bought this home for peace. But you have crossed the line again and again. I'm telling you now, stop. Respect my boundaries. If you don't, there will be consequences you won't like." For the first time, Karen seemed shaken, not just by his words, but by the calm certainty behind them. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. After a long pause, she turned and walked away, her steps slower than usual. The neighbors had been watching again. They didn't hear every word, but they saw the way Karen left, looking smaller than before. One of them whispered, "Maybe she's finally realized she can't win." That evening, Daniel returned to his dock. The lake was golden in the setting sun, the air cool and quiet. He breathed deeply, letting the peace of the water sink in. He knew Karen's fight was fading, but he also knew she was stubborn. This might not be the end. Still, he had revealed enough of his truth to make her hesitate. For Daniel, that was victory enough. He didn't want power over her, he just wanted peace. And now, for the first time since moving in, he felt that true peace might finally be within reach. The days after the confrontation felt different around the lake. For the first time since Daniel had moved into his home, the air carried a sense of quiet that he had not felt before. The constant sound of Karen's footsteps approaching, the sharp knock on his door, or the voice shouting from across the yard did not come. Instead, Daniel finally enjoyed mornings with only the sound of the lake's gentle waves and the calls of birds in the trees. He still carried his notebook and camera with him, keeping records in case Karen tried anything again. But he sensed her energy had weakened. The neighbors, however, had changed in their attitude toward him. Some who once avoided him now greeted him warmly when they passed by. A man named Richard, who had previously given him suspicious looks, came over one evening with his son and introduced himself properly. "I guess we had the wrong idea about you," Richard admitted. "Karen told us you were dangerous, but it looks like you were just defending yourself." Daniel smiled politely. "I don't hold it against anyone. Words spread fast, and it's easy to believe them when they're repeated often enough. I'm glad we can start fresh," Richard nodded, relieved. His son even asked if he could fish from Daniel's dock one weekend, and Daniel agreed without hesitation. For Daniel, small gestures like that meant more than victories in arguments. They showed that respect was beginning to grow naturally without force. Karen, on the other hand, kept a low profile. For several days, she stayed out of sight. Her usual patrols around the neighborhood stopped. Some whispered that she was embarrassed, while others said she was regrouping. Daniel didn't concern himself with her reasons. He focused on his home, his boat, and the peace he had wanted from the beginning. One evening, Daniel was surprised when Margaret, the elderly woman who had brought cookies earlier, came by again. She carried a gentle smile. "You handled yourself with such grace," she told him. "I've lived here long enough to see many arguments, but never have I seen someone stay so calm when pushed so hard. People respect that more than you know." Daniel thanked her, though he didn't dwell on praise. He had simply acted the only way he knew how, with patience and discipline. Still, it warmed him to hear that others noticed. By the end of the week, Karen finally appeared again, though not as boldly as before. Daniel was watering the plants by his porch when he saw her slowly walking down the street. She didn't carry her clipboard, and her usual sharpness seemed gone. She stopped near his driveway but didn't step onto his property. For a long moment, she just looked at him as though trying to find words. At last, she said quietly, "I went too far." Daniel put down the watering can and faced her. His expression remained calm. "Yes, you did." She swallowed hard. "I thought I was protecting the community. I thought you were a threat. I didn't check the facts, I just assumed." Daniel gave a small nod. "Karen, I don't hate you. I never wanted conflict, but you must understand what you did was wrong. You tried to use power you didn't have. You called the police on false claims. That's not protecting your community. That's abusing it." Her eyes dropped to the ground. For the first time, Daniel saw no anger in her face, only shame.
"I know," she whispered.
"I made a fool of myself." Daniel's voice softened, though it remained firm. "The past is the past. I'm not here to humiliate you further. All I want is peace. Respect my property and I'll respect yours. That's all." Karen nodded slightly and turned away. She walked back slowly, shoulders lower than usual. Daniel didn't know if her apology was full or if it was only words spoken out of embarrassment. But he decided to let it go. He had made his point, and the entire community had seen the truth. In the following weeks, life around the lake settled into a new rhythm. The neighbors stopped whispering about him and began greeting him with casual friendliness. Children played near the water without being pulled away by parents. A few even asked Daniel about his boat, curious if he would take them fishing. He agreed from time to time, enjoying the company. One Saturday morning, Daniel stood on his dock with a fishing rod in hand. The sun rose gently, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He thought back to his first days here, the endless confrontations, the false accusations, the noise of constant conflict. Now all he heard was the water brushing against the dock, the birds calling, and the laughter of neighbors in the distance. Karen was still around, but she no longer came to his property. Occasionally he would see her walking by, quieter than before. She still spoke to some neighbors, but her voice was lower, her steps slower. The absolute control she once held over the community was gone. People still respected her position in the HOA, but not her behavior. The balance had shifted. Daniel never used his badge again. He didn't need to. One reveal had been enough. People now knew who he was, and more importantly, they knew he wasn't someone to be bullied. He carried himself with quiet authority, and that was all the reminder anyone needed. Over time, Daniel began to feel what he had wanted all along: peace. He could sit on his porch in the evenings watching the sun sink behind the lake without worrying about interruptions. He could take his boat out early in the morning, drifting into the misty water without hearing shouts from the shore. He could simply live. One evening, Richard and a few other neighbors invited him to a barbecue by the lake. They laughed, shared food, and told stories. Daniel listened more than he spoke, but he enjoyed the sense of community. It wasn't forced. It wasn't controlled. It was natural, built on mutual respect. At one point during the gathering, someone asked quietly, "Do you think Karen will ever try again?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I think she's learned her lesson. Sometimes life teaches us by showing us our limits." She found hers. The group nodded in agreement. No one wanted more conflict. Everyone wanted peace just like him. That night, as Daniel returned to his porch, he looked out at the stars reflected in the dark water of the lake. He thought about the journey. From the first day Karen confronted him to the daily harassment, to the moment she froze when he revealed the badge. It had been a storm, but storms always pass. Now the air was clear, the water calm, and the peace real. Daniel sat back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. He had defended himself without anger, endured pressure without breaking, and shown the truth without needing to shout. And in the end, that strength had given him exactly what he had been searching for: a home by the lake, free from fear, free from control, and full of quiet dignity.